The palace maid remained hidden among the papyrus reeds until she was certain no one had followed her. Only then did she gather the courage to approach Merritt's humble home. She bowed deeply the moment the young woman stepped outside. "My lady," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "We have searched every village along the Nile. Everyone believes you have disappeared." The young woman glanced toward the doorway, making certain Khepri could not hear. "My father knows?" The maid quickly shook her head. "No, my lady. We dared not tell His Majesty the truth. We said only that you had wandered away from your attendants while visiting the temple gardens. The palace has searched quietly ever since." A sigh of relief escaped the young woman's lips. "If my father learned what truly happened, he would forbid me from ever leaving the palace again." The maid lowered her head. "He already blames himself whenever you are beyond the palace walls." The young woman looked back toward the small mud-brick house. She had been there only a short time, yet something about it already felt strangely comforting. There were no servants watching her every movement, no tutors waiting with endless lessons, no ministers seeking favors, only the warmth of fresh bread, the scent of herbs drying beneath the roof, and an old woman whose kindness expected nothing in return. She wasn't ready to leave, but she knew she had no choice. When she entered the house again, Merritt was preparing fresh herbs while Khepri repaired one of his fishing nets near the doorway. "You are leaving," Merritt said gently. The young woman smiled. "You already knew. The eyes often speak before the lips." Khepri slowly set the net aside. "So, your family has found you." "They have." For a brief moment, neither of them knew what to say. Finally, Khepri broke the silence. "I am glad." She looked at him, surprised. "You are?" He nodded. "I promised myself that if your family came for you, I would send you with a peaceful heart. No family should spend their days wondering whether someone they love will return." His words warmed her heart more than she expected. She stepped closer. "There is something I wish to ask." "What is it?" "My family is very protective." Khepri smiled faintly. "I had guessed as much. They would not understand if I spoke of meeting a village cook." He lowered his eyes. "I understand. But," she continued, "there is a place beside the papyrus marsh where no one comes after sunset." She hesitated before gathering the courage to finish. "If your work allows, would you meet me there from time to time?" Khepri looked at her quietly. "You would return?" "I would." He smiled for the first time that morning. "Then I shall be there." Merritt watched them both without speaking. Only after the young woman stepped outside did the old woman quietly murmur, "Be careful with your heart, child." Khepri looked at his grandmother. "I know." Merritt smiled gently. "No." She watched the young woman disappear between the reeds. "I do not believe you do." When they arrived at the palace and the great gates finally closed behind her, servants hurried to prepare fresh clothes, while worried attendants wept with relief. Her father embraced her tightly that evening, thankful only that she had returned safely from her daily prayer. He never learned of the crocodile. He never learned of her being treated by commoners and sleeping out. He never learned how close he had come to losing his youngest daughter forever, and she intended to keep it that way. The days became weeks. The weeks became months. Whenever duty allowed, Lani found a reason to leave the palace. Sometimes she claimed she wished to pray at a riverside shrine. Other times she insisted upon visiting villages to distribute grain in her father's name. The excuses changed. The destination never did. She always found her way back to the little house beside the Nile. The seasons quietly passed around them. Together they gathered herbs beneath the morning sun. Khepri showed her how to recognize willow bark from younger branches, how mint released its strongest fragrance after sunrise, and why certain flowers were never picked until evening. He taught her to bake bread inside a clay oven. She burned the first loaf, then the second. By the third attempt, both she and Merritt were laughing so hard that even Khepri could no longer keep a straight face. On another evening, he taught her to mend fishing nets. Her knots were so uneven that the first fish escaped through a hole almost large enough for a child to crawl through. "I believe the fish thanked you for your generosity," Khepri teased. She laughed until tears filled her eyes. "You are never going to let me forget that." "Never." Little by little, the distance between them disappeared. The princess, who had once been surrounded by marble halls, discovered that simple meals shared upon woven mats tasted sweeter than the finest banquets served upon gold. She learned that happiness could be found beneath a date palm, beside a quiet river, or in the laughter of ordinary people who expected nothing from her. Khepri, meanwhile, worked harder than ever before. He baked bread for weddings, he prepared feasts for harvest celebrations. He cooked for traveling merchants and helped the village healer prepare nourishing meals for the sick. Every coin he earned was carefully wrapped in linen and hidden inside a small clay jar beneath his sleeping mat. Merit noticed. "You save every deben." "I do." "For what purpose?" Khepri smiled quietly. "So that one day I may ask a certain young woman's family for permission to marry her." Merit studied him for a long moment. Then she gently placed a hand upon his shoulder. "May your kindness open the doors that silver cannot." Far away inside the palace, Lani often stood upon her balcony at night, gazing toward the distant glow of village fires beyond the Nile. Though surrounded by luxury, her thoughts always returned to the little mud brick house where bread baked before sunrise and laughter came easily. Nearly a full year passed before the peace they had found together began to change. Messengers arrived from neighboring kingdoms, bearing gifts, treaties, and royal seals. The palace buzzed with preparations for the greatest banquet held in many years. Hundreds of guests would soon fill the royal halls. Thousands of loaves would be baked. Countless dishes would be prepared. Because the royal kitchens could not meet such enormous demand alone, heralds were sent throughout the kingdom, seeking the finest cooks willing to serve during the treaty celebrations. When the announcement reached Khepri's village, many laughed and returned to their work. Only Merit looked toward her grandson. "I believe," she said softly, "the Nile is preparing to carry you somewhere neither of us expected." Khepri folded the royal notice and looked toward the river. He thought only of earning enough silver to build a future with Lani. He never imagined that accepting the palace's invitation would bring him face to face with the greatest secret she had ever kept. Before the sun had climbed above the eastern horizon, Khepri stood outside his grandmother's home, with a small bundle resting over one shoulder. Inside were only a few changes of linen, his favorite knife, several small pouches of herbs Merit insisted he carry, and the wooden spoon she had used to teach him since childhood. "It has reached the end of its life," he had told her the evening before. Merit smiled as she placed it into his hands. "So have I." He frowned immediately. "Do not speak that way." She rested a gentle hand upon his cheek. "Then do not leave it behind. Every cook should carry something that reminds him where he learned his craft." Now, standing before the doorway, Khepri embraced her tightly. "I shall return before the next moon." Merit smiled. "I know, and I shall bring home enough silver that you will never have to worry again." "My child," she replied softly, "I have never worried about silver." She looked into his eyes with quiet affection. "I have only ever worried about your heart." Khepri laughed. "My heart is quite safe." Merit said nothing. Instead, she watched him disappear down the dusty road leading toward the capital, praying silently that he was right. The royal city was unlike anything Khepri had ever imagined. Its towering gateways rose high above the streets, decorated with painted reliefs of victorious pharaohs, sacred falcons, and the gods who watched over the two lands. Merchants from distant kingdoms crowded the marketplaces with ivory, cedar wood, incense, rare spices, and brilliantly colored cloth. Scribes hurried between government buildings, carrying bundles of papyrus, while soldiers in polished armor guarded every entrance leading toward the palace. For a long moment, Khepri simply stood and stared. He had never seen so many people gathered in one place. Following the directions written upon the royal notice, he finally reached the enormous palace kitchens. The moment he stepped inside, he realized that everything he thought he knew about cooking was about to be tested. The kitchen stretched farther than he could see. Rows of enormous clay ovens glowed with fire. Dozens of servants carried baskets overflowing with onions, figs, lentils, herbs, fish, ducks, and freshly butchered lamb. Some cooks kneaded enough dough to feed entire villages. Others stirred great bronze cauldrons while shouting instructions over the constant noise. It was organized chaos. A middle-aged overseer approached without looking up from his tablet. "Name: Khepri, grandson of Merit. Village: Khepri answered. The man quickly made a mark upon the papyrus. You are assigned to Bread Hall 3. Without another word, he pointed toward a long row of ovens. Do not burn anything. Khepri smiled to himself. I shall do my best. The overseer had already walked away. For the next several hours, Khepri worked quietly. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply baked. His hands moved with calm confidence as loaf after loaf emerged from the ovens with perfectly browned crusts and soft centers. Several older bakers exchanged curious glances. One whispered quietly, "That village boy works as though the dough speaks to him." Another nodded. I have not seen hands that steady in many years. Khepri heard none of it. His thoughts drifted elsewhere. He wondered whether Lani had managed to visit the river. He had left before dawn and had no way to tell her where he was going. He hoped she would not think he had forgotten their promise. Far above the palace kitchens, hidden behind carved stone screens overlooking the inner courtyards, Princess Anippe walked beside her chief attendant as preparations for the Treaty Banquet transformed the palace into a city within itself. Servants hurried through endless corridors, carrying baskets of fruit, sacks of grain, jars of honey, and bundles of fragrant herbs. Musicians rehearsed in the grand halls, while foreign ambassadors and their entourages began arriving from neighboring kingdoms. Every corner of the palace buzzed with anticipation, yet Lani noticed almost none of it. Her thoughts were somewhere far beyond the palace walls. They were beside the quiet bend of the Nile where she and Khepri had met countless times over the past year. She had carried a burden in her heart for far too long. She could not continue deceiving him. He deserved the truth. He deserved to know that she was not the daughter of a noble family. She was the youngest daughter of Pharaoh. He deserved to know that once the treaty banquet ended, she would be promised in marriage to the prince of a neighboring kingdom, as part of the peace agreement between their nations. The thought alone tightened her chest. Every visit to the river had made leaving him more painful than the last. Today, she had resolved that there would be no more secrets. Without another word, she quietly slipped away from her attendants, changed into the simple clothing she always wore beyond the palace walls, and made her way toward the familiar meeting place, hidden among the papyrus reeds. The evening breeze drifted gently across the water. The reeds swayed softly. Birds circled above the river before settling for the night. Lani smiled as she reached the old sycamore tree, where Khepri always arrived before her. But this evening, no one was there. She waited. The sun slowly slipped toward the western horizon. She listened for footsteps she knew by heart. None came. Surely he had only been delayed. She waited a little longer. The last golden light faded from the river. One by one, the evening birds began their songs. Still, Khepri never came. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. I wanted to tell you everything, she whispered to the empty riverbank. I wanted you to hear the truth from me. She closed her eyes. Perhaps fate had already made its decision. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked back toward the palace, believing she had missed her final chance to be honest with the man she loved. She never knew that, at that very moment, Khepri was only a short distance away, working inside the royal kitchens. The palace ovens burned long into the evening. Fresh dough rested beneath linen cloth, while cooks hurried to prepare enough food to feed hundreds of honored guests. Khepri worked with the same calm patience Merit had taught him since childhood. He measured each ingredient by instinct. He kneaded every loaf with steady hands. When the first bread emerged from the ovens, its warm aroma slowly spread through the enormous kitchens. One by one, the conversations began to fade. Several cooks paused in the middle of their work. A young servant carrying vegetables stopped walking altogether. Even the older bakers lifted their heads. What is that smell? One whispered. It smells like... He stopped speaking. For a moment, he was no longer standing inside the palace. He was a little boy again, running barefoot toward his mother's oven before sunrise.